think when President Trump said he was going to do that, a lot of people in the country said, great, we all want that. We all want that to happen. But what is actually happening is over 73% of the people who have been detained have absolutely no criminal record whatsoever. And of the 27% remaining, most of them have minor traffic violations. Now take it to the children, because that's what we're talking about here. We are not talking about just screening. And I really appreciate Congressman Fry's wanting to bring a bill to protect somebody in his district who lost a child, who had a child murder. That is horrific, absolutely horrific. And I think that as a mom myself, I know that that's a very, very legitimate human response. We all want that. But what this bill does, Representative Leger-Fernandez, is to...
You just watched Representative Pramila Jayapal stand in the well of Congress and tell you that 73% of people in detention right now have absolutely no criminal record, and that we're dealing with something far more sinister than what anyone in power is willing to admit openly, because the reintroduction of the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act comes when there is a surge in detentions since President Donald Trump's return to office, with over 66,000 people currently being held, and nearly 73% without criminal convictions or with only minor offenses. And this isn't some abstract debate about procedure or policy nuance. This is about children. This is about 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds who escaped violence and horror and made the desperate calculation that crossing thousands of miles would be better than staying where they were. And what you're seeing unfold is nothing less than the complete and total perversion of what a civilized society claims to be about. Let me be absolutely clear about what this Republican bill actually does, because you need to understand the full moral catastrophe we're confronting, and you need to understand why Jayapal is using words like torture and abuse, and why this isn't hyperbole, but precisely calibrated language describing the reality that HRN provides funding for intrusive and traumatizing body examinations, which threaten the safety and well-being of minors who are victims of abuse and trafficking. And we're talking about strip searches. We're talking about taking vulnerable children who have already survived incomprehensible trauma and subjecting them to state-sanctioned violations of their bodily autonomy in the name of what exactly? Security gang prevention. But here's the bombshell that should make every single person watching this understand the utter fraudulence of this administration's claims, because while Trump and his Calalites parade around talking about deporting the worst of the worst and protecting Americans from violent criminals in the first 9 months of the Trump administration, more than 74,000 people arrested by ICE did not have a criminal record, which is over a third of all ICE arrests. And this isn't some progressive talking point. This is ICE's own internal data. This is the government's own accounting of who they're actually targeting. The architecture of cruelty being constructed right now is so vast and so deliberate that you have to understand this isn't about immigration enforcement. This is about manufacturing a permanent underclass of terrorized people and using children as leverage in that project, because provisions tucked into the massive nearly 1,000-page legislation pave the way for migrant children to face longer periods in detention with fewer legal protections. And when Democrats like Dan Goldman and Delia Ramirez introduced legislation to try to reverse these provisions, they framed it exactly correctly. They said Republicans turned their billionaire tax giveaway into a weapon against the most vulnerable children on earth, and kids who have fled trafficking and abuse should not be forced to pay thousands of dollars just to ask our government for safety. Because yes, that's right, the Republican bill imposes a new $5,000 border apprehension fee on any child who arrives to the United States between ports of entry, which is such a transparently monstrous policy that it reveals the entire game, which is to make seeking asylum so prohibitively expensive, so bureaucratically impossible, so physically and psychologically traumatizing that people simply won't do it, and then Republicans can turn around and say, see, the border is secure, when what they've actually done is weaponize poverty, weaponize trauma, weaponize childhood itself. Now let's talk about what Jayapal is really getting at when she invokes the specter of torture prisons, because this isn't rhetorical flourish, this is historical memory, because people are being held in squalor, largely in private for-profit detention facilities, all to pad the bottom lines of prison corporations that donate to Donald Trump and Republicans. And when you understand that the detention system is fundamentally a profit-making enterprise for corporations with direct financial ties to the Republican Party, you understand that every single child detained represents revenue. Every day that child stays in custody represents a line item on a quarterly earnings report. And this is what we mean when we talk about the carceral state. This is what we mean when we talk about the prison industrial complex extending its tentacles into immigration enforcement, and you can draw a straight line from the for-profit prisons that warehouse Black, brown Americans to the for-profit detention centers that cage Black and brown migrants, and the same corporations profit from both, and the same politicians receive campaign contributions from both, and the same rhetoric of criminalization, of othering, of dehumanization justifies both. But here's where it gets even more sinister, and this is what should terrify everyone, because prospective sponsors who have shown up at government offices for in-person interviews have been detained for being in the country illegally, and as one attorney put it, they are using the kids as bait, and then the kids are stuck because they are creating unaccompanied children this way. So let me
make sure you understand what's happening. The government is deliberately separating children from family members who could care for them by arresting those family members when they come forward, and then citing the fact that children are unaccompanied as justification for more detention, more surveillance, more control, and this is a closed loop of manufactured crisis where the cruelty is the point where the trauma is the policy, where every intervention designed supposedly to protect children actually generates more vulnerable children who can then be subjected to more interventions. You see this pattern again and again in how state power operates against marginalized communities, whether it's the foster care system that tears Black families apart, or the juvenile justice system that pipelines poor kids into prisons, or now the immigration detention system that takes children fleeing violence and subjects them to new forms of state violence.
What Representative Jayapal is doing in that clip, and what people need to understand, is that she's not being partisan. She's not playing politics. She's making a moral argument grounded in empirical reality about what happens when you build policy around punishment rather than protection, and the data bears her out completely, because the number of immigration detainees without criminal records who are held in federal detention centers after getting arrested by ICE has increased by over 2,000% since the start of the second Trump administration. And while the Trump administration has said its deportation effort would mainly focus on criminals deemed to be the worst of the worst, a growing share of those swept up under its crackdown are immigrants accused of living in the U.S. illegally, but who otherwise lack any criminal history, and when you have a 2,000% increase in the detention of people with no criminal record, you are by definition not engaged in public safety enforcement, you are engaged in population control, you are engaged in ethnic cleansing by bureaucratic means, you are engaged in what scholars of authoritarianism call the deliberate creation of a suspect class that can be targeted with impunity because they have been defined outside the boundaries of who counts as fully human, and Jayapal invokes the parent who lost a child, and she does this because she knows that Republicans always deploy the most emotionally manipulative cases to justify the most sweeping and punitive policies, and she acknowledges, yes, that was horrific, yes, that parent deserves justice, yes, we should absolutely work to prevent such tragedies, but then she pivots to the crucial point, which is that this bill won't prevent such tragedies. This bill will in fact create more tragedies, because when you subject traumatized children to strip searches, when you use tattoos as the sole basis for labeling someone a gang member, when you deny children legal representation, when you charge families thousands of dollars they don't have, when you detain them indefinitely in facilities designed to break their spirits, you are not creating safety, you are creating the conditions for more violence, more trauma, more exploitation, because H.R. 1 severely undermines core protections and anti-trafficking safeguards for children who arrive in the United States alone, which means that in the name of protecting children from trafficking, Republicans are actually making children more vulnerable to trafficking by stripping away the very safeguards that help identify and protect victims. The intellectual dishonesty is staggering, but it's not accidental. It's the entire strategy because you take a real problem, like the fact that unaccompanied minors are vulnerable to exploitation, and instead of addressing the root causes, which might mean examining U.S. foreign policy in Central America, or confronting the economic inequality that forces migration, or investing in robust social services, you instead propose solutions that sound tough but actually exacerbate the problem, and then when the problem gets worse, you use that as justification for even more draconian measures. And this is the authoritarian playbook. This is how fascism operates in a democracy. You create a crisis. You stoke fear around that crisis. You position yourself as the only one strong enough to solve the crisis. And then you demand extraordinary powers to address the crisis. And every step of the way you're actually making things worse, but you're consolidating power and enriching your allies and terrorizing the populations you want to control. And that's the real goal. What's happening right now with this legislation is a direct extension of what Trump attempted in his first term, but with the benefit of institutional learning about how to overcome legal and bureaucratic obstacles. Prior to the Flores settlement, kids slept in rooms with adult strangers, were subjected to arbitrary strip searches, and had no rights to visitation, education, or recreational activities, and that settlement was won through litigation. It represents decades of advocacy, and now Republicans are trying to systematically dismantle those protections through legislation because they learned that executive action could be challenged in courts, so now they're trying to embed the cruelty directly into statute, and you're watching in real time the construction of a legal architecture that will take generations to dismantle if we even can. And here's what makes this even more urgent. The proposed call center and transport programs come as the government pours $170 billion into immigration and border security, following the passage of the Republican Party's big bill, which President Donald Trump signed into law in July. So we're talking about $170 billion, not for housing, not for healthcare, not for education, not for combating climate change, but for surveillance and detention and deportation. And this is always how it works, right? We're told there's no money for universal childcare. We're told there's no money for student debt relief. We're told there's no money for a Green New Deal. But somehow when it comes to militarizing the border, when it comes to building more detention centers, when it comes to hiring more ICE agents, the money materializes like magic. And you have to ask yourself, who benefits from this allocation of resources? Who profits when we spend $170 billion on immigration enforcement? And the answer is defense contractors, private prison companies, surveillance technology firms, all of whom have lobbyists crawling all over Congress, all of whom make massive campaign contributions, and all of whom have a vested interest in perpetuating the crisis, because the crisis is profitable. Now I want you to think about what Jayapal said about the 73% figure, because this is crucial in DC. During the surge in federal law enforcement this year, more than 80% of the immigrants arrested had no prior criminal record, even though that crackdown was portrayed as targeting violent crime, and in some jurisdictions it's even higher than the national average. And when White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked about this, she said all of them because they illegally broke our nation's laws, and therefore they are criminals as far as this administration goes, which is such a perfect encapsulation of how language gets weaponized, because being present without authorization is a civil violation, not a criminal one, but by redefining civil violations as crimes, you can then justify treating everyone as criminals, you can justify detention, you can justify deportation, you can justify denial of due process, and this is classic authoritarianism. This is the state arrogating to itself the power to decide who is criminal, not based on what they've done but based on who they are. The trauma being inflicted on children under these policies will reverberate for decades, and anyone who has studied childhood development, anyone who understands how adverse childhood experiences shape brain architecture, knows that what we're doing to these kids is creating a generation of people who will carry this violence in their bodies forever, and some of them will develop PTSD, some of them will struggle with attachment disorders, some of them will have difficulty trusting authority figures or forming healthy relationships, and then in 20 years when these same children are adults, struggling with mental health issues or economic instability, the same people who traumatized them will point and say, "See, they're broken. See, they're dangerous. See, we were right to fear them." And this is how systemic violence reproduces itself. This is how marginalization becomes intergenerational. This is how we create the very problems we claim to be solving. And I need you to understand the profoundly racist underpinnings of all of this, because of the estimated 100,000 people who were deported between January and June by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. 70,000 were convicted criminals, but the data also shows that most of the documented infractions were traffic or immigration offenses, which means when they say they're deporting criminals, what they often mean is people who drove without a license because they couldn't get a license because they don't have papers, or people whose only crime is the civil violation of being present without authorization. And meanwhile, we're not seeing ICE raids at corporate boardrooms where wage theft is rampant. We're not seeing mass deportations of European immigrants who overstay visas. We're seeing targeted enforcement against brown and black migrants from Latin America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and if you think that's coincidental, if you think that's just about geography or numbers, you're not paying attention to the long history of how immigration law in this country has always been intertwined with white supremacy, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Operation Wetback to the current administration's policies. Representative Jayapal mentions Congressman Fry bringing a bill to address a constituent tragedy, and this is important because Republicans are masters at taking individual tragedies and using them to justify sweeping policy changes that wouldn't have prevented those tragedies, but do succeed in punishing entire communities, and we saw this with the Laken-Riley Act, which highlighted the killing of a Georgia nursing student by a Venezuelan man in the U.S. illegally, and Trump in January signed into law the Laken-Riley Act, which requires the detention of unauthorized immigrants accused of theft and violent crimes. But here's what they never tell you. Research has consistently found, however, that immigrants are not driving violent crime in the U.S., and in fact, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit crimes at lower rates than native-born Americans. But facts don't matter when you can deploy a victim's name, when you can put a grieving parent in front of cameras, when you can attach an emotional narrative to punitive legislation. This is why Jayapal acknowledges the pain while refusing to let that pain be weaponized, because recognizing someone's grief and refusing to let that grief become justification for harming others is what moral leadership actually looks like. The systematic dismantling of protections for unaccompanied minors is happening simultaneously with efforts to criminalize sponsors, and that's not coincidental. Recent actions by ICE increasing immigration enforcement efforts against certain unaccompanied alien children and their sponsors appear to be motivated at least in part by reporting that some 300,000 UACs are missing when they simply fail to show up to a hearing or are not served paperwork, making these actions appear to be based on a false premise or simply intended to ramp up arrests and removals. And this is such a perfect example of how misinformation becomes policy, because the claim that 300,000 children are missing suggests trafficking, suggests crisis, suggests government failure, when the reality is much more mundane, which is that people move and addresses change, and our immigration system is so backlogged that court dates get scheduled years in advance, and notices don't reach people. But rather than fix the underlying system, Republicans use the scary 300,000 number to justify more surveillance, more enforcement, more cruelty. And here's where I need you to really sit with the horror of what's being proposed, because we're talking about strip searches of children. We're talking about 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds being subjected to invasive physical examinations by government agents, and anyone who has any understanding of trauma, anyone who has any comprehension of what sexual abuse survivors experience, knows that strip searches can be re-traumatizing, that forcing someone to remove their clothing against their will is a violation, that for children who have already experienced abuse, this is compounding trauma with trauma. And the Republican argument is that we need these searches to identify gang tattoos, but think about what that means. We're preemptively treating children as gang members based on skin markings, we're using bodily characteristics as proxies for criminality, and where have we seen that before? Where in human history have we seen regimes that categorize people as dangerous based on physical markers? Where has that led? The for-profit nature of detention cannot be emphasized enough, because billions of taxpayer dollars are being funneled into the hands of private prison, corporations, profiteers who are building and operating abusive detention facilities, while deaths in custody and other egregious abuses reach record levels. And these are not abstract policy failures. They are the lived realities of the 66,000 people disappeared into an inhumane system that has long thrived on opacity, minimal oversight, and virtually no accountability. And when you have a system that profits from detention, you have a system that has financial incentive to maximize detention time, to fight against alternatives to detention, to lobby for harsher policies that generate more detainees. And this is why Jayapal and other progressives have been pushing the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, which would phase out the use of private detention centers by about 2029, because you cannot have humane immigration policy when the people implementing that policy have profit motives that directly conflict with humane treatment. What's happening to migrant children right now is part of a larger pattern of how this country treats children who don't have power, children in poverty, children of color, children in the foster system, children in juvenile detention, and in every case we see the same dynamics where rhetoric about protection masks policies of punishment, where concern about safety justifies control, where the stated goal is care, but the actual mechanism is carceral, and you cannot understand immigration policy in isolation from criminal justice policy, from education policy, from housing policy, because these are all part of the same structure of who gets resources and who gets surveillance, who gets support and who gets punishment, who is seen as deserving and who is seen as disposable. And when Jayapal stands up and says this bill will make child abuse worse, she's making a specific empirical claim that when you strip away legal protections, when you make it harder for children to access counsel, when you subject children to traumatic procedures, when you separate children from potential sponsors through enforcement actions, you are creating conditions where abuse thrives, because abuse thrives in contexts of powerlessness. Abuse thrives when victims have no recourse. Abuse thrives when institutions prioritize control over care, and every single provision in this Republican bill moves in the direction of less accountability, less oversight, less protection, which means more vulnerability, more exploitation, more abuse, and then Republicans will turn around and say, see, we need even more enforcement. See, we need even stricter policies, and the cycle continues. The broader context that makes this even more devastating is that Republican colleagues chose to ignore requests from the Department of Health and Human Services for new laws that would protect children, and instead of passing proposals that would help Republicans pass legislation that put unaccompanied children in even more danger. So when HHS said we need more resources for anti-trafficking programs, Republicans said no. When they asked for lower cost sharing for grants to help trafficking victims, Republicans said no. When they requested expanded training for preventing human trafficking, Republicans said no. But when it came time to authorize strip searches, when it came time to cut legal representation, when it came time to impose thousands of dollars in fees, suddenly Republicans found their legislative energy, and this tells you everything about priorities. This tells you everything about who matters and who doesn't. I want to return to the 73% figure one more time, because it's so central to understanding the lie at the heart of this administration's immigration policy. Trump and his officials constantly talk about removing the worst of the worst. Department of Homeland Security spokeswoman said the administration is targeting the worst of the worst criminal illegal aliens, including murderers, rapists, gang members, pedophiles, and terrorists. But only 1.8% of the total convictions against criminals had to do with sex offenses, and another 1.2% were for sexual assault, out of 100,000 deportations. So if you do the math, that means that over 95% of people being deported were not convicted of the violent crimes that Trump uses to justify his policies. And this is the scam where you put the most extreme cases in front of cameras, where you highlight every single instance of a crime by an undocumented person, where you create the impression that every immigrant is a rapist or murderer, when the data shows overwhelmingly that they're not, and then you use that manufactured fear to justify policies that target everyone. The historical parallels are impossible to ignore, because we've seen this before. We've seen governments use fear of the other to consolidate power. We've seen moral panics around threats to children used to justify authoritarian crackdowns. We've seen marginalized populations scapegoated for social problems they didn't create. And every single time, the people warning about fascism were told they were being hysterical, were told they were exaggerating, were told to calm down, and every time those warnings were vindicated. And here we are again watching a government systematically strip rights from vulnerable people, watching legislation designed to inflict maximum cruelty, watching children used as political pawns, and being told that calling it fascistic is going too far. But what else do you call it when the state claims the right to detain people indefinitely, without meaningful due process, when profit motive drives enforcement, when entire populations are criminalized based on their origin, when children are subjected to state violence in the name of security? Representative Jayapal is standing in that chamber as the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, and she has said ICE is acting like a rogue force, kidnapping and disappearing people off the streets with no due process, and she's introduced multiple bills to address this, including the Stop ICE from Kidnapping U.S. Citizens Act. Because yes, ICE has been detaining American citizens, and yes, that is illegal, and yes, when a government agency operates with such impunity that it kidnaps citizens, that's a rogue agency, that's a threat to democracy. That's exactly the kind of unchecked power that founders supposedly created separation of powers to prevent. But here we are because Republicans control Congress, and Republicans have decided that their political future depends on maximizing cruelty toward immigrants, and Democrats are too afraid of being called soft on immigration to mount the kind of full-throated opposition this moment demands. And so children suffer, and families are torn apart, and people with no criminal records sit in detention centers run by corporations that profit from their misery. The question before us is not whether immigration policy should exist. It's what values that policy embodies, and right now, we have a policy that embodies white supremacy, that embodies capitalist exploitation, that embodies authoritarianism, that embodies patriarchy, in its assumption that state power can violate children's bodies with impunity, and the alternative isn't open borders, isn't no enforcement. It's policy grounded in human rights and dignity, in the recognition that migration is a human phenomenon that has existed for all of human history, that will continue to exist regardless of how many walls we build, or how many agents we hire, and that the question is whether we respond with compassion or cruelty, with solidarity, or scapegoating with justice or violence. And everything about the Republican bill, everything about Trump's approach, everything about the entire apparatus being constructed chooses cruelty, chooses scapegoating, chooses violence. And when Jayapal says this makes child abuse worse, she's not being hyperbolic, she's being precise, she's being truthful, she's telling you exactly what will happen if this bill passes, and the only question is whether enough people are willing to believe her, whether enough people are willing to act, whether enough people understand that what happens to migrant children in detention centers is connected to what happens in every community, when state violence becomes normalized, when profit drives policy, when some lives are deemed expendable. This is the fight we're in, and it's not just about immigration, it's about what kind of country we're building, what kind of future we're creating, what kind of ancestors we want to be,